And I was interested in how human beings use their natural resources around them, specifically plants. And so I worked in northern Guatemala with a group called the Kekchi Maya in the lowland tropical forests of the Petén and the Alta Verapaz in Guatemala, and was interested in how they made a living through plant-based technologies. Yeah.
Welcome everyone to this week's episode of The Sea Has Many Voices. I'm Dr. Greg Stone, and I'm here at College of the Atlantic, a very special place for me in Bar Harbor, Maine, with the president of College of the Atlantic, which, having been a student here, has gotten a special status in my mind. Like you're like, the guy that was up on the pedestal in those days. Dr. Darron Collins, and we're looking out over Frenchman's Bay, and it's right at the beginning of what do you call it? Commencement.
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 Up,
I would
yeah.
get that confused.
Yeah.
Commencement and.
It's convocation.
Convocation. That's the word I was thinking of. Convocation. Yeah.
Which is a gathering of eagles. That's the plural form of eagles, is a convocation of eagles.
Is that where it comes from?
Yeah, like a murder of crows, it's a convocation of eagles. Yeah.
Oh, that's really cool. I didn't know that. And I learned this morning from Katona that college comes from the Greek to gather.
Yeah, that collect. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. But anyway, we'll have fun with words in a bit here. So, Darron, tell me about yourself. My listeners are interested in I want to hear your journey. I'm interested too. I actually don't know it all that well, although I've enjoyed working with you a lot recently. We'll get to that later. But.
Great. Yeah, so thanks for having me, Greg.
Yeah.
And I was born in New Jersey, in ultimate suburban New Jersey, like the hotbed of marine science on the East Coast. But actually, not near the Jersey Shore. It was a commuter place for New York, and it was very stereotypical suburban. But my mother had this huge influence on me in terms of a love and passion for the outdoors, and would help me seek out any little corner of woods that may have been left over from development.
Did she create the interest, or did she stimulate it?
I think she was a model. She had it herself, and I had it in me genetically, but also learned it through her. And so, even though I was, grew up in this concrete, suburbanized environment, early on, my love was for the outdoors. And, I'm the first one in my family to have gone off to college. And so at 18, when the time was right to go search for a college, I didn't really have much guidance as to what that would look like, although I knew I loved the outdoors and I was passionate for the environment. And those are really the two things that I had.
Reminds me of E.O. Wilson, comes to mind, because he grew up in New York City.
Yeah.
I don't know if you knew that.
And I didn't know that, no.
And he got his love of nature from the park and the Natural History Museum.
Yeah.
And then, of course, he went on to become one of the world's great evolutionary biologists. So you came from an urban environment and you searched the nature out, and that led you to College of the Atlantic, right?
It did. I mean, I would say I was even worse off than E.O. Wilson. I didn't have a museum to go to, but my dad had this friend that went to Bowdoin, right, which is Bowdoin's right down the coast, and Brunswick, and so in his mind, Maine and environment went hand in hand. So we went on this father-son trip up to Bowdoin College, and he got out of the car and saw Bowdoin and said, "This is it, right? This must be a perfect collegiate environment with the greens and the columns and the ivy growing up the walls." And I said, Dad, I'd read about this other place called College of the Atlantic up a little bit further up the coast. Can we go check it out? And he said, sure. So we got in the car, pulled into the front entrance here, and I got out of the door, and I stood face to face with this massive finback whale skull that
I knew that whale.
Right? You knew the whale. And I turned to my dad and I said, this is where I want to go to college. And he said, what the hell is this place? Like it didn't line up with what college meant. We're a very different institution, and this was back in 1987, and that's what brought me to College of the Atlantic. He learned to love it. I had 4 of the most extraordinary years, like you did. And I have to say,
I'm an alum.
When I got the what they call the curriculum program guide, and I was reading through it, and I came across this guy that had spent loads of time underwater doing exploration, and his name was Greg Stone in 1982, and I said, that's the guy I want to be. I want to do.
I'm humbled.
That, and I swear to God, it's very true. And that said, I said, if I can do that here, that's where I want to go. And we've had different paths. I'm not an expert on oceans. I spent then time doing a PhD in cultural anthropology, and I was in the tropical forests of Guatemala and the Amazon basin.
What is cultural anthropology?
A cultural anthropology is the study of existing human cultures. Here in the United States, compared to Europe, we look at linguistics, archaeology, cultural anthropology, and physical anthropology as the kind of 4 cornerstones of what it means to understand humanity. And I specialized in working with existing human cultures, so I wasn't interested in past human cultures or our biological evolution as Homo sapiens.
What's an example of a piece of cultural anthropology?
Margaret Mead. She's that's the archetypical cultural anthropologist.
So it's like the study of people's habits and their belief systems and their
material culture. And I was interested in how human beings use their natural resources around them, specifically plants. And so I worked in northern Guatemala with a group called the Kekchi Maya in the lowland tropical forests of the Petén and the Alta Verapaz in Guatemala, and was interested in how they made a living through plant-based technologies.
I'm really interested in, I've heard it said that everybody's like an armchair anthropologist. Because anthropology is the study of humans, and everybody's interested in humans because we are humans.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of want to push in on this a little bit. So a cultural anthropologist studies, is it only living cultures?
Traditionally, yeah.
So
if I were an archaeologist, I would be interested in human culture, but as expressed in past human cultures by their material remains. When you spend time out in Polynesia working with people on how they navigate the Pacific waters, you're doing cultural anthropology. You're doing ethnography, which is the practice of cultural anthropology.
Because there's a story that I've been tracking. It fascinates the hell out of me. It's this. I think it's a physical anthropologist or archaeologist. You tell me. Who's found those caves in Mossel Bay, South Africa, where they've got evidence of human habitation back 200,000 years. Yeah. And they've determined that that's when we started to live along the coastline and start to use human ocean resources. And they dig down, 200,000 years in one spot. Yeah. They find, now they're physical anthropologists?
Yeah, or biological anthropology, or there's techniques in archaeology also.
What kind of an anthropologist is he?
Who's that?
Jared Diamond.
Oh, Jared Diamond. Well, Jared worked in Papua New Guinea early in the 60s on, bird calls. He spent a lot of time, and so he did cultural anthropology. Okay. He was working with existing Trobriand Islanders, not Trobriand, the PNG Islanders, and so Jared would be a cultural anthropologist.
And an ornithologist.
Yeah, and a great ornithologist.
Yeah, and he's a fellow guest of the show, too.
I watched it, and a hero of mine, for sure.
Yeah, he's just a wonderful dear friend of mine. I love Jared. Yeah. And he's so humble, too, because when I talk to him about stuff, I go, Jared, I'd like to talk to you about this or that. He says, well, great, all I know is about Papua New Guinea and birds. You know that, right? Right. But all you have to do is, open the door, and he's, got a world view. All right, so cultural anthropology after a human ecology degree, and they're kind of connected, aren't they? Human ecology and anthropology. Yeah. Never really thought about that till right now, actually. And where did you pick that up, the PhD?
I did that at Tulane University in New Orleans,
That's
which
fancy.
had it was very different than my experience as an undergraduate at COA. I had a great background in anthropology at Tulane, and Tulane had a long history of doing more archaeological research on the Yucatan Peninsula and in Mesoamerica and throughout Guatemala. So the institution had deep roots in that part of the world, and so I did work among an existing group of Mayan speakers called the Quechua Maya. Spent a lot of time learning language because you can't really have a window into a group's culture without that language background.
So you became fluent in that?
I did.
That dialect?
Yeah, I spent two years more or less in northern Guatemala.
I think you're right about that. You know, like the places that I've worked, as you mentioned earlier in the Pacific, those the foreigners are called imatang in the country that I tend to work in. They went to learn the language.
Yeah.
They penetrated so deep.
Yeah.
And made interestingly, some of those foreigners that came in, learned the language, wrote books and all that kind of stuff. Admittedly, they know the language better than the locals, I'm told, because they studied it in all of
grammatically,
in its
right.
entirety.
That's right.
Rather than the colloquials that they'll have on each island.
That's right.
They'd say, "Oh yeah, that man, he really knew our language better than us.
Right.
He could speak all these various."
No, but language, as you know, I mean, it's a total window into the world, and it was the most fulfilling part of my time in Guatemala was learning Quechua and being there with my wife. Those two things opened up a world that would have been closed if I hadn't
It's
been.
nice to share things with your loved ones, isn't it?
Yeah, the funny story here, I'll tell you, is we were 20, I was probably 27, 28 years old at the time. Karen and I just got married, moved to Guatemala, and the community was very worried about us because they said they saw we were married, but we didn't have kids, you know, and the men would come up to me and they would say, "Well, Darron, you know what you have to do to have children, right?"
If you didn't understand the process?
That's right. They were worried about that, and they were worried about my hair because I was already losing my hair. And so the women would have a great time rubbing avocado on my head, and it didn't work. As a plant-based remedy for baldness, did not work. Yeah. But I loved my time in Guatemala.
You know, I was working in an indigenous culture once, and we were talking about conservation and the health of a wild population of animals.
Yeah.
And it came down to describing it as, if you want them to be healthy, you stay out of their bedroom.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is you allow them to reproduce and prosper.
Yeah.
So I know from my knowledge of you, then you went to World Wildlife Fund?
That's right. Yeah. So I graduated, and I was fortunate to start work with World Wildlife Fund, the WWF, based in Washington, D.C. And I focused first on, I was the forest conservation coordinator throughout Latin America. So, you know, I knew Spanish and Portuguese and Quechua at that time. So I worked throughout the hemisphere, which was fun. And I had colleagues in Mesoamerica and Peru and Bolivia and Brazil and the Amazon and all the way down to the Valdivian forests in Chile. And I think it says a lot that WWF, you know, I wasn't a forestry expert necessarily. I had worked a lot in forests, but I was an anthropologist. And I think one of the great things about WWF as an organization was that they understood that, you know, conservation was about human communities, and understanding how people use natural resources and what was dear to them was absolutely crucial. So
you and I both also share that work in the world of large NGOs, or they're colloquially called bingos.
Yeah.
Big international NGOs. I was at Conservation International, and you were at WWF.
Mm-hmm.
And I was there for the mission shift at CI when we went from a focus on biodiversity to a focus on providing human well-being through biodiversity, which is what you just kind of referred to there. And it came naturally to me, and I was new to the organization when it happened, but it caused a big chasm. The ground moved in the organization, and a bunch of people left.
Yeah.
People that loved species, that loved wildlife,
Yep.
felt that we were going against the original doctrine. because we were not looking at, the bottom line wasn't conservation of species, the bottom line was providing benefits to humans on a sustainable basis.
Yeah.
And to me, that's the paradigm that has emerged in the world, where that's where we need to focus. It's not about, it often is the same, but at the end of the day, with the poverty, with the nutritional problems in the world, with the social problems in the world, we can't take our eye off the needs of humans, the children, especially the poorer communities in the world. So conservation turned into a development program, really, more than a conservation effort, in my experience. I think you and I were probably experiencing that in different ways at different organizations. So you were at WWF and you rose to be a vice president or something pretty high up.
I didn't have that title. I building off what we always said, and I think it's a great catchphrase, that hungry poor people make very poor conservationists, right? Like if you don't simultaneously provide for human needs,
it's not going to work.
It's not going to work.
It's not going to work. Yeah, my old boss, Peter Seligman, used to say, it was a good way to describe it, he said, we used to think that we could put biodiversity in a lockbox and it would be preserved.
Yeah.
But we found out that eventually people would go into the lockbox.
Yeah.
So we brought people in at the start and integrated them in the system.
Yeah.
And only then, and with that arrangement, would the arrangement be long-term and sustainable. So, one of the premises of this show is that the ocean and humanity share the same fate.
Yeah.
It's kind of a simple way of putting it.
Yep.